Waiter asks for a raise. Boss mocks and gives him a math problem, but he solves it on the spot. Jason Miller was wiping the same restaurant table for the 10th time when he mustered the courage to do what he'd been putting off for months. For 2 years, he'd worked at Taste and Heritage, one of the most elegant restaurants in New York City, and had never received the raise promised by the manager. He approached the table where Richard Thompson, a 55-year-old man known for his arrogance, was reviewing the night's receipts. The manager looked up with disdain as the waiter approached. "Mr. Thompson, may I speak with you for a minute?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Make it quick, I've got more important things to do," Richard replied without lifting his eyes from the papers. "It's about the raise you promised me 2 years ago. My salary is still the same," and a loud laugh echoed through the dining room, drawing the attention of other staff. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. "A raise?" he chuckled. "You think you deserve a raise just because you wipe tables properly?" Jason felt his face burn with embarrassment. The few remaining customers had started tuning into the conversation. The manager loved making a spectacle out of humiliation. "Sir, I'm always on time. I've never missed a shift. The customers always praise my service." "Anyone can do that, kid," Richard interrupted, grabbing a napkin. "You know what separates an ordinary waiter from someone who deserves a raise?" Jason shook his head, expecting a sensible answer. "Intelligence," Richard said, scribbling something on the napkin. "Here's a test. If you can solve this little math problem, we'll talk about a raise. If not, stop bothering me with this nonsense." He slid the napkin toward Jason. On it was a complex equation with square roots and fractions that seemed impossible to solve without a calculator. "You've got 5 minutes," Richard declared, checking his watch with a smug grin. Jason stared at the problem. His mind began working automatically, identifying patterns and possible simplifications. The years spent studying alone at home after work were finally about to pay off. He grabbed a pen from his shirt and started writing next to the equation. First, he factored the most complex expressions. Then he applied root properties he'd learned from online tutorials. Nearby customers stopped eating to watch. Richard kept smiling, certain he'd created an impossible situation for the waiter. In 3 minutes, Jason turned the napkin back to the manager. "The answer is 42, he said simply. Richard's smile vanished. He snatched the napkin and checked the calculations line by line. Everything was correct, each step perfectly executed. "You must have guessed," he muttered, though his voice trembled slightly. "I can explain every step if you'd like," Jason offered, noticing how pale the manager had become. A couple at the next table began clapping softly. The woman whispered to her husband how impressive it had been to witness. Richard crumpled the napkin abruptly and stood up. "This proves nothing," he said too loudly. "Anyone can memorize a few math tricks." "Sir, you said if I solved it, I said we'd talk. I didn't say I'd give you a raise," Richard cut in. "Now get back to work. There are tables to clean." Jason stood still for a moment, processing the humiliation. Around him, staff and customers watched in awkward silence. "Are you deaf?" Richard shouted. "Get back to work." That night, Jason finished his shift with a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was the certainty that no matter what he did, he'd always be seen as inferior by people like Richard. The next morning, Jason arrived at work to find he'd been assigned the overnight shift. It was the worst possible schedule, few customers, little tip money, and the responsibility of closing the restaurant alone. "Schedule change," Richard announced with a fake smile. "I thought you'd appreciate more responsibility." Jason knew it was retaliation, but said nothing. He needed the job. Over the next week, he discovered Richard was inventing problems where none existed. He complained the tables weren't clean enough, that Jason was too slow with service, that his posture wasn't professional. "You know, Jason," said Ashley, a waitress who'd worked there 5 years, "Richard did the same thing to Mike, remember?" Jason did. Mike was a hard-working guy who'd asked for a raise the year before. 2 weeks later, he was fired for poor performance. "And with Sarah, too," Ashley continued. "She even cried when she left, said she never wanted to work in a restaurant again." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, Take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Jason began to realize the math problem hadn't been an intelligence test. It was a trap. Richard never expected anyone to solve it. It was just another way to humiliate employees who dared ask for better conditions. During his Thursday overnight shift, an elderly woman entered the restaurant minutes before closing. Jason considered telling her the kitchen was closed, but something in her expression changed his mind. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I help you?" "Good evening, dear. I know it's late, but do you still serve anything? Anything at all?" The woman looked tired, and Jason noticed she walked with a slight limp. She was around 70, with neatly styled grey hair and a kind expression that reminded him of his grandmother. "Of course, ma'am. Let me see what I can do." Jason quickly put together a simple sandwich and brought it with a cup of hot tea. The woman ate slowly, clearly savoring every bite. "It's delicious, thank you," she said. "How much do I owe you?" When she reached for her purse, her expression changed completely. "Oh dear, I think I left my wallet at home," she murmured, searching her bag. "How embarrassing." "Don't worry, ma'am, it's on the house," Jason said without hesitation. "No, dear, I can't accept that. You work hard for your money." "I insist. It happens to anyone." The woman looked at him with an expression Jason couldn't quite place at the time, though later he'd recognize it as admiration. "What's your name, young man?" "Jason Miller, ma'am." "I'm Margaret Wilson, and I won't forget this kindness." The next morning, Richard called Jason in for a private talk. "I heard you gave away free food last night," he said accusingly. "The lady forgot her wallet, sir. I thought it best—" "You thought it best to cost the restaurant money," Richard interrupted. "That'll come out of your paycheck." Jason felt anger rising but kept his voice steady. "Sir, it was just a sandwich and tea. The cost is minimal." "The cost doesn't matter. It's the principle," Richard declared. "And since you're so fond of charity, you'll stay on the overnight shift. Indefinitely." That day, Jason worked in silence, wondering if he should look for another job. But jobs were scarce, and he needed the income to help his mother with bills. Around 3 in the afternoon, an elderly woman walked into the restaurant. Jason recognized her immediately, Margaret, the woman from the night before. "Good afternoon, Jason," she said with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson. How are you?" "Much better after a good night's sleep and with my wallet in the right place," she laughed. "I came to pay yesterday and thank you in person." Margaret insisted on paying double for the meal despite Jason's protests. "It's the least I can do," she said. "I need to tell you something. Yesterday, when I was leaving, I saw you solving a math problem for that rude man." Jason was surprised. He hadn't realized she'd witnessed the scene. "Do you understand math?" "I was a teacher for 40 years, dear. High school math," Margaret answered proudly. "And I can assure you that problem wasn't simple at all. Where did you learn to solve it?" "Online, Mrs. Wilson. I study on my own when I get home." "Why?" Jason hesitated. He wasn't used to sharing his dreams with strangers, but there was something about Margaret that inspired trust. "I want to study engineering in college, but I need to improve my math first." Margaret's eyes lit up in a way Jason didn't expect. "And what did that man say when you solved the problem?" "That it proved nothing, and he moved me to the worst shift as punishment." Margaret's expression hardened. "Son, that man is a fool, and a coward on top of it," she said firmly. "I'll make you an offer." Jason waited, curious. "How about I give you some math lessons? For free, in my spare time?" "Mrs. Wilson, I can't accept—" "Of course you can. Consider it my way of repaying your kindness yesterday." Jason felt tears welling up. It had been so long since anyone offered help without expecting something in return. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely. In fact, I heard you're not the only employee here studying. How about we make it a group lesson?" The idea excited Jason, but reality quickly set in. "Mr. Thompson won't like it. He says employees should focus only on work." "Who said he needs to know?" Margaret said with a mischievous smile. "We can meet right here after hours, or at my place if that's better." Jason glanced around the restaurant. Ashley was cleaning nearby tables and had clearly overheard. She approached shyly. "Sorry for listening, but were you serious about the lessons?" Of course, dear. How many of you are studying? There's me, Jason, Ryan from the kitchen, and Jessica at the register, Ashley replied. We all want to go to college, but studying alone is hard. Perfect, Margaret said, clapping her hands. Lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. At my place. I'll give you the address. When Margaret left, Jason still couldn't believe what had happened. For the first time in months, he felt real hope. But the joy didn't last. Richard had watched the whole conversation from afar, and his expression was far from friendly. Jason, come here, he called. Yes, sir. What did that old woman want? Jason hesitated. Technically, there was nothing wrong with accepting private lessons, but he knew Richard well enough to suspect trouble. She came to thank us for yesterday's service. That's all? Yes, sir. Richard studied him for a few seconds, clearly suspicious. Good. And remember what we said about staying focused on work, right? Yes, sir. But Jason knew Richard suspected something. Throughout the day, he noticed the manager watching his interactions with co-workers more than usual. The following Tuesday, Jason, Ashley, Ryan, and Jessica met at Margaret's house. It was a simple but cozy home, with shelves full of books and a blackboard in what used to be the dining room. Welcome to my private school, Margaret said enthusiastically. Let's start by reviewing the basics and then move at your pace. The 2 hours flew by. Margaret had a gift for explaining complicated concepts in simple terms, and more importantly, she genuinely believed in each of their abilities. You're all smarter than you think, she said at the end of the first class. You just need the right guidance. The classes became the highlight of Jason's week. He'd come home excited, practiced the exercises Margaret assigned, and for the first time in years he felt like he was actually making progress. But hiding the classes from Richard was getting complicated. The manager would ask indirect questions, change schedules without warning, and seemed always to be trying to catch the 4 employees in some inconsistency. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, in the 5th week of classes, the inevitable happened. Richard showed up at the restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly when Jason, Ashley, Ryan, and Jessica weren't working. Where are the others? He asked the employee covering the shift. I think they went to lunch together, the young man replied unsuspectingly. Richard left the restaurant with a dark expression. On Thursday, when the group arrived for class, Margaret seemed worried. Something strange happened yesterday, she said. A man showed up on my street asking about you. He said he was from your workplace. Jason's stomach dropped. What did he look like? About 55, balding, wearing a grey suit. Seemed very unpleasant. That was Richard, Ashley whispered. He found out. Found out what? Margaret asked, confused. Are you doing something wrong? Jason explained Richard's veiled threats, how he didn't like employees getting distracted with studies, and the culture of fear that dominated the restaurant. That's absurd, Margaret declared, visibly irritated. You have every right to study in your free time. Mrs. Wilson, you don't know Richard, Jessica said. He's fired people for much less. Then maybe it's time someone met Richard's boss, Margaret replied firmly. Jason didn't understand what she meant, but there was something in her voice that suggested more than simple indignation. The following Friday, Jason arrived at work to find the atmosphere even tenser than usual. Richard was especially irritable, yelling at employees over minor things. Around noon, a well-dressed man in his 60s entered the restaurant. Jason didn't recognize him, but noticed how Richard's demeanor completely changed when he saw him. Mr. Anderson, Richard said with exaggerated deference. What a pleasure to have you here. A special table. No, Richard. I came to talk to you, the man replied in a deep, serious voice. Jason realized this must be Robert Anderson, the restaurant's owner. He'd only seen him once briefly when he was first hired. Of course, sir, shall we go to my office? I'd prefer right here, Robert said, looking around the dining room. I want to see how things run day to day. For the next hour, Jason discreetly watched as the owner walked through the restaurant, talking to employees and customers. Richard followed him like an anxious dog, trying to explain every detail of the operation. At one point, Robert approached Jason. "You're Jason Miller?" "Yes, sir," Jason replied, surprised to be recognized. "I've heard great things about your work. Congratulations." Jason glanced at Richard, who looked confused and slightly worried. "Thank you, sir." "Actually," Robert continued, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about how things run here. Do you have a minute?" "Of course, sir." Robert led Jason to a secluded table, leaving Richard behind with an increasingly troubled expression. "Jason, I need you to be honest with me. How is the work environment here?" It was a dangerous question. Jason knew his answer could have serious consequences, both for him and his co-workers. "It's challenging, sir." "Challenging how?" Jason took a deep breath. The moment had come to decide whether he would keep accepting the situation or risk everything for a chance at change. "Mr. Anderson, there's a climate of fear here. Employees are afraid to voice opinions, ask for improvements, even to study in their free time." "Study?" "Yes, sir. Some of us are trying to further our education, but we're discouraged, as if it's harmful to our work." Robert asked several specific questions about schedules, employee treatment, and internal policies. Jason answered everything honestly, even as he noticed Richard watching the conversation from a distance with growing unease. "Jason, you mentioned some employees are studying. Tell me more about that." Jason explained Mrs. Wilson's classes, the college dreams he and his co-workers had, and how it had improved not just their knowledge but also their self-esteem. "And does Richard know about this?" "He found out recently, sir, and he wasn't happy." "I see," said Robert, jotting notes in a small notebook. "One more question. Have you ever solved a math problem for Richard?" Jason was surprised. How did Robert know? "Yes, sir. He gave me a complex problem when I asked for a raise." "And you solved it?" "Yes, sir." "What was his reaction?" Jason recounted the whole story, the public humiliation, the correct answer, and the retaliation with the overnight shift. Robert closed his notebook with a thoughtful expression. "Jason, thank you for your honesty. You can go back to work." For the rest of the day, Jason noticed Robert continued questioning other employees. Ashley, Ryan, and Jessica were called in for private conversations. Richard was visibly nervous, trying to intervene whenever possible. At the end of the shift, Robert asked to speak with all the staff together. "Everyone, I want to thank you all for your cooperation today. I've learned a lot about how our restaurant operates day to day." Richard forced a smile, clearly relieved to think he'd passed the test. "I'll be making some operational changes," Robert continued. "Starting next week, we'll have new HR policies." "What kind of changes, sir?" asked Richard. "You'll find out on Monday, Richard, along with everyone else." That weekend, Jason barely slept. He didn't know if he'd done the right thing by being honest with the boss. Maybe he'd just lost his job. On Monday morning, all employees were called to a meeting before the restaurant opened. Robert was there, along with Richard and a woman no one recognized. "Everyone," Robert began, "I'd like to introduce Jennifer Davis, our new HR coordinator. She'll be implementing some important changes." Jennifer stood with a professional smile. "Starting today, we'll have a clear professional development policy. Employees who are studying or upskilling will receive company support, including schedule flexibility when needed." Jason could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Additionally," Jennifer continued, "we'll implement regular performance reviews based on objective criteria. Raises will be granted based on actual merit, not favoritism." Richard had gone pale. "We also have a new conflict resolution policy. Any employee who feels mistreated or humiliated will have a direct channel to report it." "And finally," Robert said, taking over, "I'd like to announce some changes to the management structure." The silence in the dining room was absolute. "Richard, you will be transferred to the role of administrative assistant. Your managerial responsibilities will be redistributed." Jason watched Richard's face cycle through a range of emotions: shock, anger, humiliation. "Mr. Anderson, I don't understand. My work has always been exemplary." "Richard, your management created a toxic environment that harmed both employees and the restaurant's reputation. It's time for a change. "And who will take over as manager?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "For now, Jennifer will oversee operations directly. Later, we'll evaluate internal promotions based on competence and leadership." After the meeting, the staff buzzed with excitement. It was as if a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Jason approached Mr. Anderson before he left. "Sir, may I ask how you found out about the math lessons?" Mr. Anderson smiled. "Margaret Wilson is an old acquaintance. In fact, she was my daughter's teacher many years ago. When she told me about all of you, I knew I had to look into it personally." "Mrs. Wilson knows you?" "Yes, and she was outraged when she heard how you were being treated. She's the one who suggested I visit the restaurant unannounced." Jason felt a wave of gratitude. Margaret had done far more than offer free lessons. She had changed all their fates. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant's atmosphere transformed completely. Without the constant fear of retaliation, the staff began working with renewed enthusiasm. Service improved, customers noticed the difference, and even revenue increased. Richard, now in a subordinate role, had to learn firsthand what it felt like to be treated without respect. Surprisingly, the experience began to change him. He started to understand the impact of his past actions. Jason received the raise he'd asked for with back pay. Ashley was promoted to dining room supervisor. Ryan became head chef, and Jessica took over cashier coordination. The lessons with Margaret continued, now with the company's official support. Other employees joined the group, and Margaret expanded the classes to include English, history, and even basic business skills. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. 6 months after the change, Jason took the engineering entrance exam. Margaret's lessons had given him not only the necessary foundation in math, but also the confidence to believe he could succeed. When the results came out, he could hardly believe it. He had passed, and not just passed, he ranked among the top scorers. Mr. Anderson offered him a part-time work arrangement so he could study. The company even created an internal scholarship program for employees who wanted to further their education. "You know why I did it?" Richard asked one day when he and Jason found themselves alone in the storage room. "The math test? Yeah, why do you think I humiliated people like that?" Jason had thought about it a lot. "Insecurity." Richard let out a deep sigh. "Exactly. I never had a proper education. I got this job through a recommendation from Robert's cousin 20 years ago. I was always afraid people would find out I wasn't as competent as I pretended to be. And when someone asked for a raise, it felt like they were challenging my authority. So I made up those impossible tests to prove they didn't deserve it. I never expected anyone to actually solve them. And when I did, I got angry and scared. If you were smart enough to solve that problem, maybe you were smart enough to realize I didn't know what I was doing." Jason was silent for a moment. "Richard, you know it's never too late to learn, right? Mrs. Wilson always says that." "Do you think she'd take on another student?" asked Richard in a barely audible voice. "I'm sure she would." The following week, Richard showed up timidly at Margaret's house. At first, the other students were uncomfortable, but Margaret reminded them that education was for everyone, no matter their past. It was a difficult process for Richard. He had to face not only gaps in his knowledge, but also the shame of his past actions. But gradually, as he learned, he also became a better person. A year later, Jason was in his second semester of engineering when he got an unexpected call from Robert. "Jason, I need a favor. I'm thinking of opening a second restaurant, and I'd like your help with the financial calculations and the layout design. Sir, I'm still just starting college, but you have something many graduated engineers don't: hands-on restaurant experience and a real understanding of how things work." Jason accepted the challenge. Working on the new restaurant's design was an incredible experience. He could apply engineering concepts he was learning in school while using his practical industry knowledge. The second restaurant was a success from day one. Jason was asked to take over operational coordination, a role that combined his technical skills with his customer service experience. Margaret, now 72, was still teaching. Her private school had become a local benchmark. Dozens of adults had gone through her classes and achieved dreams they once thought impossible. "You know the secret," she told Jason during a Sunday afternoon chat. "I never doubted your abilities. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was a lack of opportunity and someone to believe in you." Jason looked around the room where it had all begun. The walls were covered with photos of former students who had graduated, landed better jobs, or simply discovered they were capable of far more than they'd imagined. "Mrs. Wilson, you've changed so many lives." "No, dear, you all changed your own lives. I just showed you the way." At the third restaurant in the chain, which opened 2 years later, Jason was no longer just an employee. He was a minority partner and the technical lead for the entire operation. He had graduated with honors in engineering and was pursuing a master's in business administration. Ashley had started her own hospitality consulting firm. Ryan had created a line of food products sold in all 3 restaurants. Jessica was finishing her accounting degree and managed the financial side of the entire group. And Richard? He had become the training coordinator for new hires. His transformative experience made him attuned to signs of insecurity and fear in new employees. He developed a mentorship program that became a model for other companies. "I never imagined that math problem would change so many lives," Robert remarked during a planning meeting. "Actually," Jason said, "the problem didn't change anything. What changed everything was how people reacted when I solved it." "What do you mean?" "Richard expected me to fail, to keep me in my place. Mrs. Wilson saw my potential and chose to help me. You recognized there was a problem in the work environment and took action. Everyone responded differently to the same situation." Jason was right. The math equation was just numbers on paper. But the human choices that followed transformed not only his life but dozens of others. Today, 5 years after that humiliating math test, Jason is a certified engineer, partner at a thriving company, and proof that determination and opportunity can overcome any barrier. But perhaps his greatest achievement isn't professional. It's the knowledge that an ordinary person with the right support and fair opportunities can accomplish extraordinary things. Mrs. Wilson continues teaching, now over 75 years old. Her home has become too small for the number of students, so lessons are held in the event hall of the main restaurant every afternoon. "Teacher," Jason said during a tribute marking 5 years of classes, "you've taught math to hundreds of people. What's the greatest lesson you've learned?" Mrs. Wilson smiled with that familiar sparkle in her eyes. "That everyone is capable of learning. The problem was never a lack of intelligence. It was a lack of someone who believed in them." The audience applauded, but Jason knew there was something deeper in that answer. Mrs. Wilson hadn't just taught math. She had taught dignity, self-worth, and the courage to dream big. The restaurant where it all began still exists, but now it's just part of a business group employing over 200 people. And every one of them knows the story of the waiter, who solved a math problem and not only changed his own life, but set a new standard for treating employees with respect and recognizing potential where others saw only labor. Richard, now 60, still works for the company. He never became a brilliant mathematician, but he learned something even more valuable, that true leadership doesn't come from intimidation, but from empowering others to be better. "Jason," he said in a recent conversation, "you taught me that humiliating someone didn't make me superior, it just made me cruel. And you taught me that everyone can change, Richard, even when it seems impossible." The story spread throughout the region. Local newspapers wrote about the restaurant that became a school and how a simple retired teacher created a quiet revolution in the lives of dozens of families. But for Jason, the real lesson wasn't in awards or public recognition. It was in the certainty that when someone gives us a real chance to prove our worth, we can surprise even ourselves. At Jason's engineering graduation, Mrs. Wilson sat in the front row, applauding with tears in her eyes. Beside her were Ashley, Ryan, Jessica, and even Richard, all proud of how far he'd come. "Mrs. Wilson," Jason said during his graduation speech, "you once asked me why I studied math. Today I can answer, because numbers don't lie. They show the truth. And the truth is, with education and opportunity, anyone can achieve their dreams." The math problem Richard had used to humiliate him was framed on his office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that how we respond to challenges defines us far more than the challenges themselves. Now, when Jason interviews job candidates for his companies, he doesn't give math tests. Instead, he asks about dreams, goals, and what the person needs to grow professionally. Everyone has potential, he often says. Our job is to create an environment where that potential can flourish. And so, a math equation that began as a tool for humiliation became a formula for human dignity, proving that knowledge, when shared generously, can multiply opportunities exponentially. Jason's life had completely changed, but he never forgot the humiliation of that night. Every time he saw an employee struggling with self-doubt or fear, he remembered how he'd felt when Richard had exposed him in front of everyone. That's why, when he decided to expand the business to other cities, he made sure to include in the company's values unconditional respect for all employees, regardless of position or education. "Mr. Miller," said a young waitress at the opening of the Miami branch, "is it true that you used to be a waiter too?" "It's true," he answered without hesitation, "and I learned that there's no such thing as a small job, only small-minded people." End of story. And you? What did you think of this story of perseverance? Has anyone ever underestimated you because of your job or social standing? Share your experience in the comments and whether you were able to prove your worth. Leave a like if this story moved you, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one.